The dusty stage rolled into Red Hollow just after noon, its wheels creaking over the ruts that split the main street. Eleanor Vance stepped down with a carpetbag in one hand, and her other hand held tight around the letter that had brought her west. The town looked smaller than the paper drawings had promised, and harder too. Low boardwalks, weathered timber fronts, a saloon with one swinging door, a blacksmith's forge breathing smoke into the dry wind. Beyond it all, the land flattened into pale grass and distant brown ridges under a white sky. She did not smile. There was nothing to smile at. Yet a few men had gathered near the hitch rail, and their attention found her at once. Not with welcome, with the slow, measuring interest reserved for a woman arriving alone. Eleanor kept her chin level and moved past them, as if she belonged there. That was the first lesson of the frontier. If a woman looked uncertain, the whole town made a meal of it. The driver set her bag down beside her boots. "Mercer Place is out south," he said. 50 minutes by horse, more or less. Then I'll go there when I'm told." His eyes flicked to the sealed letter again, then away. "You're the bride?" "I am." He gave a short nod, as if that settled a thing no one had truly agreed upon. At the end of the boardwalk stood a man in a dark coat, broad in the shoulders, hat brim shadowing most of his face. He had the kind of stillness that made other men seem restless by comparison. Caleb Mercer did not cross the street to greet her. He simply waited while the wagon pulled off, and the town continued staring. Eleanor looked at him once, then at the ground between them, then back again. He was younger than she had expected from the letter, though there was nothing youthful in the hard line of his mouth, or the dust in the seams of his coat. "You came," he said. It was not warm. It was not cruel, either. "I had no reason not to." That drew the smallest shift in his eyes, though he did not answer. He took her bag without asking. Not kindly, not roughly, just as if it weighed what it weighed, and nothing more. He led her to a horse and a second saddle, then mounted without offering her a hand. Eleanor gathered her skirts, placed one boot in the stirrup, and climbed up herself. The ride out of town stretched along a pale, rutted trail that crossed a dry wash and then climbed into open country. Wind ran over the grass in long, cold breaths. Far off, a hawk circled above the ridge. Caleb rode a little ahead, silent the whole way, and Eleanor let him keep that distance. She watched the land instead. Broken fence lines, one abandoned shack, a line of cottonwoods near a seasonal creek, the low shape of a ranch house finally appearing like a promise that might yet be broken. When they reached the Mercer place, she saw it was larger than the town had implied. A main house, a barn with new boards on one side, a corral, a well, and beyond that, more acreage than a modest ranch ought to hold. Caleb swung down first and tied his horse. Eleanor remained in the saddle a moment longer, taking it in. A woman appeared at the doorway, older apron dusted with flour, face pinched with caution. She looked Eleanor over once, and then looked away as if the answer to a question had already disappointed her. Caleb said, "This is Mrs. Dutton." She keeps house. Mrs. Dutton's gaze moved to the carpetbag, then to Eleanor's boots, then to the sealed letter tucked in her reticule. "You'll sleep in the east room." The words were practical, not welcoming. Eleanor dismounted. "Thank you." The older woman gave a faint nod and turned inside. Caleb did not move aside to guide Eleanor in. Instead, he stood near the porch rail and studied her with that same silent, measuring look. She met it without flinching. "You know what was said in the letter?" he asked. "I know enough." His jaw tightened, though whether at her answer or at the whole business of letters and expectations, she could not tell. Inside, the house smelled of pine smoke, old wood, and bread cooling somewhere deeper in the kitchen. It was plain but sturdy, with none of the softness of a settled family home. Eleanor understood at once that every object had been chosen for use, not comfort. That told her something about the man who lived here. On a side table near the stair rail sat a ledger book, and, half covered beneath it, a folded sheet of official paper with a county seal pressed into red wax. Caleb noticed her glance, reached over, and turned the paper face down with one hand. The motion was quick, almost careless, but Eleanor saw enough to know it was not a bill or a letter from town. It was something more important than that. Mrs. Dutton led her upstairs without comment and opened the east room. A narrow bed, a washstand, one small window looking out over the yard and the distant, wind-striped grass. "You can unpack here," she said. "Supper at 6 then, c'est left." Eleanor stood alone in the room and set her bag on the bed. Through the window, she could see Caleb crossing the yard below, already back to his work, as if her arrival had only interrupted an ordinary day. He paused once at the barn door and looked toward the house, not with tenderness, not with invitation, but with the guarded attention of a man who had decided to let time prove things for him. Eleanor rested one hand on the window frame and looked out over the raw land. She had come west to be married, but what stood waiting here was not marriage yet. It was a trial of silence, distance, and weather. And somewhere beneath the plain order of this ranch, she had already seen the first edge of a secret. The first thing Eleanor Vance learned about the Mercer ranch was that work here began before the light was fully awake. By the time she came downstairs the next morning, the stove already breathed heat into the kitchen, and Mrs. Dutton had a pot of coffee on the boil, a pan of biscuits set near the iron, and a look on her face that made plain she did not enjoy surprises. Caleb Mercer was already gone. His horse had been taken from the yard before dawn. Eleanor did not ask where. She dressed in her plainest traveling skirt, pinned her hair back, and came to the kitchen with her sleeves rolled. If the ranch was going to decide whether she belonged, she would not wait to be told. Mrs. Dutton handed her a basin and a towel. "Wash up before you touch anything." Eleanor did as she was told. Then she dried her hands and looked around the room with the eye of a woman who had spent too many years in places where every item mattered because there was too little of it. The shelves were well stocked, but not full. The flour bin was a basket of mending sat near the back door. The pantry door did not shut quite right, and the latch had been repaired more than once. "You? So?" Mrs. Dutton asked. "Yes." "Good. There's a stack in the blue trunk upstairs. Torn shirts. A pair of trousers gone at the knee. If you can make them last another season, that will help." Eleanor nodded once and took the basket. The morning moved with a quiet rhythm of practical necessity. She mended seams by the window, sorted worn cloth into useful strips, and saw at once that the ranch was running leaner than it wished to appear. Not starving, not failing, but kept alive by discipline and habit rather than comfort. That told her Caleb Mercer knew exactly what he was doing, whether he spoke of it or not. When the wash-water went out back, she noticed a boy near the barn, maybe 12, thin as a rail, and watching her from under a shadowed brow. He did not approach. When she looked directly at him, he turned his head as if he had only just discovered the fence line required inspection. Mrs. Dutton followed Eleanor's glance. "That's Will Barnes. He helps when he's told." "Barnes?" Eleanor asked. "His mother's kin. He stays here half the week. Caleb doesn't talk about it much." The answer was clipped, but it opened a door. There were family threads in the place, and some of them had been knotted tight enough to stay out of easy conversation. By late morning, Eleanor had finished the first shirt and moved on to the second when a sharp crack cut through the yard. Not a gunshot. A snapped board. She stepped to the window in time to see a side plank on the pump shed sag under the weight of a water bucket and split clean through. Water sloshed across the dirt. Mrs. Dutton was already heading outside, muttering under her breath. Eleanor set down her needle and followed. The break was not dangerous, but it was inconvenient in the way only a ranch could understand. A small failure that could become a bigger one if ignored. Caleb would not be back until afternoon. Mrs. Dutton stared at the ruined board with thinly veiled annoyance. "I can fix that," Eleanor said. The older woman looked at her as if deciding whether the statement was foolish or useful. Eleanor took the hammer from the nail hook before either of them could argue. The board had split near a knot, which meant the replacement had to be measured, trimmed, and set clean, or it would warp in the weather. She worked with her sleeves pushed back, jaw set, one hand steadying the new plank while the other drove the nails with a sure, efficient rhythm. A minute later, Will Barnes drifted closer. He watched without speaking, then crouched to hold the lower end when she signaled him with a quick tilt of the head. A was silent, but he was paying attention now. When the last nail went in, Eleanor tested the board with her palm. Mrs. Dutton stared at the repaired shed a moment longer than necessary. "You were a carpenter's daughter." "No," Eleanor said. "A blacksmith's." That was not quite true. It was better than the truth would have sounded in a woman's mouth at this ranch, and the lie was small enough to carry. Mrs. Dutton grunted, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in her expression that might have been approval. It was near midday when Caleb came back from the south pasture. He rode in with dust on his boots and a hard line between his brows, then stopped when he saw Eleanor standing beside the pump shed with a hammer still in hand. The repaired board was already drying in the sun. He looked from the shed to Mrs. Dutton, then to Eleanor. "Who did that?" "She did," Mrs. Dutton said. Caleb dismounted and came closer, eyes narrowing on the clean line of nails and the level fit of the plank. He ran one hand along the edge and found no give. "You fixed it right," he said. It was not praise exactly. It was recognition. Before Eleanor could answer, a rider appeared on the road beyond the yard. He did not come at a gallop. He rode slow enough to be deliberate, as if he wanted the whole ranch to see him arrive. The man was broad, expensive in his clothes without being polished, and carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Dutton's mouth tightened. "That's Ezekiel Barnes." Eleanor felt Caleb go still beside her. Barnes dismounted without hurry, brushed dust from one glove, and let his gaze slide across Eleanor with open calculation. "Mercer," he said, "I was passing through and thought I'd see whether this place was still standing." Caleb's voice stayed flat. "It is." Barnes smiled without warmth. "For now." Eleanor saw, then, the shape of the pressure around the ranch. This was not a casual visit. It was a warning dressed as courtesy. Barnes's eyes returned to her. "And you must be the bride." Eleanor did not lower her chin. "And you must be the man who thinks his manners travel better than his purpose." For a heartbeat, the yard went still. Then Caleb turned his head just enough to look at her, and the corner of his mouth moved once, almost imperceptibly. Not amusement, something closer to surprise. Barnes's smile thinned. He tipped his hat with mock politeness and looked past her to Caleb. "Word in town is that you've taken on extra trouble." Caleb did not answer at once. He only reached for the repaired shed door, tested it once, and shut it with deliberate care. "We've got work to do," he said. Barnes lingered long enough to make the silence unpleasant, then mounted again and rode out with slow patience, as if he had every intention of returning when it suited him. When the dust settled, Eleanor picked up the fallen bucket and righted it beside the pump. Caleb watched her for a moment as she did it. "You should have left that to Dutton." She had enough on her hands. That wasn't the question. Eleanor met his eyes. "No, it wasn't." He held her gaze a second longer, then looked away toward the road Barnes had taken. There was no softness in the set of his shoulders, but there was something else now. Awareness. He had expected a bride. What he had found was a woman who noticed broken things and fixed them without asking permission. And as the wind moved over the yard, and the ranch settled back into its working silence, Caleb Mercer watched Eleanor Vance with a new caution, as if he had just discovered she was not the one who needed protecting first. The trouble began before Eleanor could name it. By the third day at the Mercer ranch, she had settled into the rhythm of the house well enough to notice what did not belong. A tin cup left where no one had set it. A gate that had been closed the night before and stood open at dawn. A sack of grain shifted an inch too far from the pantry wall, as if someone had searched behind it and put it back with care. Nothing dramatic. Nothing a careless hand could prove, but enough to make the skin at the back of her neck tighten. Caleb said little about anything outside the work of the place. Arose early, rode out hard and came back with dust on his boots, and silence still clinging to him. Eleanor had learned he did not waste motion, and that the ranch answered to discipline more than to speech. That made the small disturbances harder to dismiss. In the morning, Mrs. Dutton found the south fence line cut in two places, both near the creek wash, not badly enough to drop stock yet, but badly enough that a loose animal could drift through by nightfall. Caleb crouched beside the brakes, fingers on the snapped wire, eyes narrowed at the clean angle of the cuts. "Not weather," he said. "No," Eleanor answered before anyone else could speak. "Weather bends." This was made. Caleb turned his head and looked at her with that quiet, measuring attention of his. Mrs. Dutton stared at the wire a second longer, then spat into the dirt and muttered something that did not sound like prayer. They spent the rest of the morning repairing it. Eleanor worked beside Caleb for the first time without the distance of a window or a doorway between them. He handed her pliers when she needed them and held the wire steady with bare hands that showed no reaction to the scrape of metal. He did not talk much, but he did not send her away either. That mattered more than a compliment. Later, while the others were occupied, Eleanor went to the storage shed for twine and found something that did not belong with the ranch supplies. A narrow iron box hidden behind feed sacks, not locked, but tucked out of casual sight, old enough to have been moved many times. She might have left it alone if the lid had not been set slightly crooked, as if someone had handled it recently and been in too much of a hurry to hide the fact. She hesitated only a moment before lifting it. Inside were papers, folded and tied with faded ribbon, each bearing county seals and careful script. Deeds, several of them. Not for the ranch she could see from the porch, but for surrounding acreage well beyond it. One map showed boundary lines that stretched south into the low basin and west toward the ridge country. Another document carried a name she did not know, linked to Caleb Mercer with signatures and dates older than she expected. Eleanor closed the box at once and stood very still. This was not a small holding kept lean by hardship. This was something larger, older, and deliberately hidden. She turned the matter over in her mind while she folded laundry later that day, but she said nothing. Not yet. Caleb had not lied in the plain sense. He had simply withheld the true scale of himself, and the difference was important. In a place like this, secrets were often less about deceit than survival. By afternoon, the air had grown sharp and dry. Will Barnes came in from the yard, carrying a split bucket, and Eleanor sent him to fetch nails. He obeyed without complaint. He had taken to watching her work from the corner of his eye, not because he distrusted her, but because he seemed to be measuring how long it would take for her to leave like other people had. She did not leave. A little after supper, a rider came at a gallop and pulled hard at the rail. It was one of Caleb's men from the outer pasture, face gray with hurry. A calf had gotten loose near the north wash, and the gate there had been found on. The timing was too neat to ignore. Someone wanted the ranch scattered and occupied. Caleb took his coat at once. Eleanor moved before she thought to ask, already reaching for a lantern. "You stay here," he said. "No." His eyes hardened slightly, not in anger, but in warning. Eleanor lifted the lantern. "Anyway, if someone is trying to pull you away from the house, then I'm more useful here if I know what's been moved and what hasn't." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Mrs. Dutton, who had come to the doorway with her hands on her apron. "She stays with you," Caleb said. It was not permission. It was recognition that she had already chosen. The next hour made plain how quickly a quiet ranch could become a place of tension. Eleanor checked the pantry, the tack room, and the side shed, while Mrs. Dutton watched the yard. She found one latch loosened and one rope cut short enough to look accidental from a distance. Small sabotage, meant to pass as carelessness, meant to create doubt. When Caleb returned, dust streaked his shirt and frustration tightened his jaw. He stopped in the yard, took one look at Eleanor carrying the lantern, and understood at once that something had happened while he was gone. "Who was here?" he asked. "No one," Eleanor said. Then, after a beat, or someone careful, she handed him the cut rope. He looked at it, then at her. "Anything else?" Eleanor hesitated only once. "Tense scythe. I've found your papers." Mrs. Dutton's head snapped up. Caleb did not move. For several seconds, only the wind crossed the yard. At last he said, "Where?" "In the iron box." His face did not change much, but something in it tightened, as if a door had been opened inside him and he had not meant for it to open yet. Eleanor saw, then, that he had expected that box to remain untouched. Not forever. Just longer. "You should not have gone looking," he said. "No," Eleanor replied. "I should have gone looking sooner." That made him look at her directly. There was no argument after that. Only the plain fact that the ranch had been under pressure before she arrived, and that pressure was now closing in from more than one side. Eleanor held the lantern steady and met Caleb's eyes without backing down. She had not challenged him with anger. She had done it with clarity. And in the hard, wind-stung quiet of the yard, Caleb Mercer understood that whatever secret he had meant to keep buried, Eleanor Vanth had already found its edges. By the next morning, Eleanor no longer needed proof to know Caleb Mercer was larger than the ranch he rode. The papers in the iron box had already done their work. They sat in her mind while she helped Mrs. Dutton knead dough, while she swept the kitchen floor, while she folded a shirt for Will Barnes, and watched the boy pretend not to notice her watching. The seals, the boundary lines, the names on the deeds, none of it fit the plain image Caleb kept at the edge of town. He did not bring the matter up at breakfast. He rode out before the coffee cooled. That silence might have lasted longer, if not for the woman who came that afternoon. Martha Quinn arrived in a tidy dark dress and a hat pinned with respectable care, the kind of widow who had learned to be welcomed without ever asking for it. She knew Mrs. Dutton by name, and used it well. She knew how to stand in a doorway as though she had every right to be there. Eleanor saw immediately that she was not a stranger to this ranch. Not truly. Martha's eyes moved once toward Eleanor, then away again, polite and unreadable. "I came with news from town," she said. Mrs. Dutton looked wary. "What sort of news?" Martha lowered her voice, just enough to suggest concern. "Barnes has been talking. He says the county men are asking after Mercer's claims again. Says a man with holdings like his ought to be clearer about what belongs. Where?" Eleanor felt the shape of the warning before she fully understood it. This was not a courtesy call. It was a hand slipping something dangerous across the table. Mrs. Dutton's mouth tightened. "Ezekiel Barnes has too much time and not enough shame." Martha gave a small, practiced sigh. "I only thought you should know." Eleanor watched her closely. Martha did not look at Caleb's absence once. That was what gave her away. Not fear. Not surprise. Familiarity. After Martha left, Eleanor went back to work, but the room had changed. Something had been handed over that did not belong to gossip alone. Near dusk, Caleb returned with his horse wet at the flanks, as if he had ridden hard and long. He came in through the kitchen without removing his gloves and found Eleanor at the table, the deed papers spread beside a sewing basket. She had moved out of instinct more than planning. His gaze settled on the papers, then on her. "I told you not to touch those, and I told you I should have looked sooner." He gave a single, clipped breath through the nose. It was the closest thing to irritation she had seen from him. Martha's visit had changed more than the air in the house. Eleanor could tell from the way Caleb's shoulders set and from the long pause he gave before speaking. "What else did she tell you?" "Nothing." "Enough." That made him look at her sharply. "She said Barnes is talking." Caleb's jaw worked once. Barnes talks when he can't buy what he wants. The answer was blunt, but it carried the weight of something old. Eleanor studied him. "Then that's why you hid the scale of it." He did not deny it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in low, dry waves. Then Eleanor took one of the deed sheets, not to keep it from him, but to read the line at the bottom one more time. The acreage stretched farther than anyone in Red Hollow would have guessed. More than enough to make Caleb wealthy by local standards. More than enough to make the ranch into a target. Before she could set the paper down, Will Barnes came through the back door too fast. Face pale, one sleeve torn. He had been sent to the east fence, and had returned with dirt on his hands and a mark of fear he did not know how to hide. "Someone's out by the lower pasture," he said. Mrs. Dutton crossed herself once and muttered, "Lord, preserve us." Caleb was already moving, but it was Eleanor who saw the second part first. Will's torn sleeve was wet at the cuff, and his hand kept closing as if it hurt. She caught his wrist before he could pull away. "Show me." He hesitated, then held out his palm. There was a splinter driven in deep, ugly and fresh. Not enough to stop him from walking, but enough to show he had tried to pull free from something rough. "Did someone grab you?" she asked. The boy looked away. "No, just the fence." It was a lie badly told. Eleanor let it stand for the moment, but her attention shifted at once toward the window and the yard beyond. Caleb saw it too. He crossed to the door, looked out, and stopped dead. At the far edge of the property, near the low line of cottonwoods, a rider waited in silhouette, not close enough for confrontation, close enough to be a threat. Barnes had not come himself. That would have been too direct. This was message, not visit. Caleb stepped onto the porch and stood there long enough for the rider to understand he had been seen. Then, without speaking, he went to the tack room and came back with a rifle. Eleanor had expected anger. What she saw instead was a colder thing. Decision. He checked the chamber, lifted the rifle, and looked once at Eleanor through the open door. Stay inside. That might have been the end of it if Martha Quinn had not chosen that moment to return, breathless and white-faced, as though she had run from town. "I shouldn't have said anything," she blurted, too quickly, too loudly. Ezekiel was asking after the old claim papers. "I only thought—" Eleanor turned toward her at once. The lie in the woman's voice was not complete, but it was enough. Caleb did not ask what she meant. He looked at Martha, then at the rider, then back at the woman in the doorway. Something in his face settled into certainty. "You told Barnes what was in the county records," he said. Martha flinched, and that was answer enough. She tried to recover. "I didn't mean harm. I only thought if he knew you were sitting on land that should have been settled years ago." "Go home," Caleb said. It was not a shout. It landed harder than one. Martha stared at him, then at Eleanor, as if expecting rescue from the woman she had just betrayed. None came. Eleanor felt no pity in that moment, only a clean, bitter understanding of what had been done. Martha left with her pride broken and her hands trembling. Caleb watched her go, then shut the door and turned to Eleanor. "I should have told you sooner." There it was, at last. Not confession, not explanation, only the edge of admission. Eleanor stood very still. "Yes." He gave a slow nod, as if that answer cost him more than hers had cost her. Outside, the rider finally moved off, and the long line of the horizon swallowed him. Inside the house, the papers lay open on the table, no longer secret in the same way. Eleanor looked at them, then at Caleb. He had hidden the size of his name from the town, but not from the land, and not from the danger that followed it. And for the first time, he understood that she was not simply the woman who had come west to be married. She was the one person in the house who now knew exactly how much he had been carrying alone. The day of the Red Hollow livestock auction broke bright and dry, with dust already rising from the road before noon. By then, word had spread through town that Caleb Mercer would be there, and that was enough to pull half the county toward the rail yard like iron to a magnet. Men came in hats, tipped low, women in their best practical dresses, children clinging to skirts, all of them hoping to see something worth remembering. Eleanor came with Caleb in the wagon, sitting straight back beside him, while the boards rattled over the hard ground. He had said little since morning. She had dressed plainly, but with care. Dark skirt, clean collar, hair pinned close. Mrs. Dutton had watched her leave and said, "Only keep your head high." Eleanor intended to do exactly that. The auction yard was loud with cattle, rope, smoke, and voices. Men moved along the fence line, studying stock with the same hard calculation they brought to everything else. Near the center of it all stood Ezekiel Barnes, dressed better than the occasion required, smiling as if he owned the weather. He saw Caleb at once. Then he saw Eleanor, and let his gaze linger long enough to make the insult plain. "Didn't expect you to bring your trouble into town?" Barnes said as they neared. Caleb stopped at a respectful distance. "You should have expected I'd come." Barnes looked between them, amused. "Word is, the ranch has been getting more attention than it ought to." Eleanor heard the hidden audience in that sentence. Several nearby men had gone quiet, pretending not to listen. Barnes wanted them listening. He stepped slightly toward Eleanor. Not enough to touch, just enough to crowd the air. A woman can cause a man to lose his judgment if he lets her. Eleanor met his eyes without blinking. A man can lose his manners without any help at all. A few heads turned. Barnes's smile sharpened. He reached into his coat and drew out folded papers, holding them up for those nearest to see. County notice claims. Old lines marked in ink. He spoke loud enough for the circle around them to hear. There are holdings in this county being hidden from proper review. A man shouldn't be allowed to sit on land the records say ought to be settled. That was the snare. And it was meant for Caleb. Eleanor saw it at once. If Caleb protested too quickly, he would look guilty. If he stayed quiet, Barnes would shape the story for everyone else. Before Caleb could answer, another voice cut across the yard, low and level. Those papers are dated wrong. The speaker was the county recorder, Thomas Halley, who had come with a satchel under one arm and dust on his boots. He looked unhurried, which made the yard go even stiller. He had been invited by Barnes under the pretense of clarifying titles, but his face said plainly that he had already found the lie in the invitation. Barnes's smile flickered. Mr. Halley ignored him and stepped to the rail where the sale notices were pinned. He opened his satchel and removed a second set of copies. The claims were filed years later than Urasuhesting, and these boundary marks were altered after the fact. The men nearest the fence shifted uneasily. A few women leaned in from the boardwalk. Barnes's jaw tightened. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He stood so still he seemed carved from the dry air, but she could see the pressure in the set of his hand, the way his fingers had closed once around the edge of his hat. This was the moment Barnes had built, and it was falling apart in public. Barnes tried another angle. Fine records don't explain why Mercer keeps the extent of his land out of town talk. Halley turned the copied pages once, calm as stone, because he was under no obligation to announce every acre to men with an appetite for it. That landed harder than any shout. Barnes's face darkened. "You knew about this," he snapped, turning on Caleb. Caleb's voice came quiet, flat, and final. "I knew enough to keep what was mine from people who'd take it if I made it easy." The words moved through the crowd, not loud, worse, certain. Ezekiel Barnes made the mistake then of looking directly at Eleanor, as if she were the weak point in the line. "You believe this man has been honest with you?" Before Eleanor could answer, she saw the shape of the whole thing at once. Barnes had wanted to use her presence to unsettle Caleb, to make him look defensive, perhaps to paint the ranch as a private nest of impropriety. He had not counted on the records being real. He had not counted on Halley. Eleanor stepped forward. The auction yard seemed to draw breath and hold it. "I know he is not a man who says more than he must," she said, "but he has never once asked me to believe a lie." Barnes gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "And that makes him innocent." "No," Eleanor said. "It makes him careful." The word struck home because it was true. Then she turned her head and faced the gathered crowd. "And if you want the truth of this ranch, ask who stands to gain if Mercer is pushed off his land." That was the point Barnes had not expected, not merely defense. Attack. Eleanor's voice did not tremble. She gave the question to the crowd and let it work on them. A murmur moved through the yard. Several heads turned toward Barnes. Men who had once nodded along with him now looked less certain. Barnes flushed. "You're accusing me in front of this whole town." Eleanor did not back down. "I'm saying what you already know." The silence after that felt heavier than the dust. Caleb moved then. Not fast, not dramatic, simply decisive. He took one step forward and positioned himself at Eleanor's side, close enough that there was no question where he stood. Then he reached into his coat, removed a folded document, and held it out to Halley. "I filed the rest in Canyon City last winter," he said. "Every title, every boundary, every acre." A ripple moved through the crowd. That was the first clear sign that Barnes had misjudged the man in front of him. Caleb looked at Eleanor once, then back to Barnes. "She had nothing to do with your games. Put her name out of your mouth." It was not a speech. It was a declaration. Barnes tried one last smirk, but it had gone brittle. The crowd had shifted against him. The recorder had exposed the records. The town had seen Eleanor stand her ground. And now Caleb had stepped forward in a way that could not be mistaken. Barnes tucked the papers back under his arm with too much force. "This isn't over." Caleb's answer came without heat. "No." It isn't. Barnes walked away under the watching eyes of Red Hollow, and this time no one followed him with admiration. Eleanor remained where she stood, the wind lifting a loose strand of hair near her cheek. Caleb did not look at the yard anymore. He looked only at her, as if the rest of the world had finally become less important than the fact that she had not broken. And in front of the whole town, with dust on his boots and steel in his voice, Caleb Mercer made it plain that Eleanor Vance was not a passing inconvenience, not a bride bought and forgotten, but the woman he had chosen to stand beside when it mattered most. The consequences began the next morning, and they did not soften. By then, Red Hollow had already decided what to make of Ezekiel Barnes, and for once the town was not wrong. The recorder's papers had been passed from hand to hand, read in private, then discussed in public by people who had spent years pretending not to notice how Barnes bought influence the way other men bought tobacco. A few of his allies tried to act as though the auction had been a misunderstanding. No one listened for long. Barnes lost more than face. The county men put a hold on the disputed claims. The buyers he had counted on backed away, and the men who once followed him for advantage began to keep their distance. He still rode the roads, but no one waved him down. In a place like Red Hollow, that was a kind of death. Martha Quinn did not escape cleanly either. The town did not turn vicious, but it turned cold. Women who had once welcomed her now received her with careful silence. The simple truth of it was plain. She had chosen advantage over trust, and the cost arrived faster than she expected. She tried twice to speak with Eleanor, but Eleanor gave her neither anger nor comfort, only distance. Martha had made her choice in the dark. She could live with the daylight. At the Mercer ranch, the air changed after the auction, not because the danger was gone, but because it was no longer hidden. Caleb did not pace the yard or waste words on what had happened. He went back to work, checked the fences, rode the lower pasture, and met every task with the same steady precision he had shown from the beginning. But now Eleanor saw the weight he had carried alone, and that changed the way she moved through the place. She did not become passive in his relief. She took her place in the running of the ranch with the same practical force she had shown from the first day. She ordered supplies before they ran thin, kept the accounts aligned with the kitchen stores, repaired what could be repaired without waiting to be asked, and made sure Will Barnes had work with meaning instead of errands that only kept him busy. The ranch did not become gentler. It became more whole. One evening, while the light was going soft over the yard, Eleanor found Caleb in the tack room, sorting leather straps by length. He looked up when she entered, then set the bundle aside. "You should have told me sooner," she said. He did not pretend not to know what she meant. "I know. That was all at first." She watched him for a moment. "You hid it because you thought the town would come for it." "Yes. And because they would have looked at me differently once they knew." His jaw moved once. He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice stayed low. "They would have." That was the final piece of it, and Eleanor understood then that his silence had not been a slight against her. It had been a wall he built to keep the wrong kind of attention away from her as much as from himself. She crossed the room and took the leather strap from his hand. Not gently, not harshly, simply as a woman who had earned the right to stand in the same silence as him. Then Caleb did something he had not done before. He took the strap back only long enough to set it aside, turned toward her, and rested one hand against the bench, as if gathering himself. When he looked at her, there was no avoidance left in his eyes. "I chose you," he said. The words were plain enough to carry twice over. Eleanor held still. The room felt narrow around them, the late wind moving the boards outside, a horse shifting in the yard. "You didn't need me," she said. "No." That answer came too quickly to be anything but true. He let the pause stretch. Then, with the same economy he used for everything important, he added, "I wanted you here anyway." That was the closest thing to a declaration he had given her yet, and because it was Caleb Mercer, it landed with more force than a speech ever could. The next morning, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Caleb in a hand Eleanor did not know. He opened it at the table after breakfast and read it once through without changing expression. Then he folded it and set it down. "Trouble?" Eleanor asked. "Yes." He said it with such calm that it took her a second to understand the meaning. Not panic, not surprise, a matter already set in motion. He slid the letter toward her. It came from Canyon City, from a man involved in old land filings, and it hinted that one of the claims Barnes had tried to stir up might not be fully dead after all. A missing line, a contested signature, something that could reopen the matter if the wrong man pressed it. The ranch was safe for the moment, but not forever. Eleanor read the letter and looked up. Then we meet it before it grows teeth. Caleb's mouth shifted, almost into a smile, but not quite. That afternoon she took the letter to the kitchen fire and burned the edge clean, then went to the shelf where the ranch accounts were kept and began sorting them into order. If there was one thing the last weeks had proven, it was that danger came dressed in paper as often as in a rifle. She would not let either of them be caught unready. Caleb watched her from the doorway for a long moment, then turned and stepped back out into the yard. The sun was lowering over the ridge, turning the grass copper and the dust gold. Will Barnes was near the fence, with a hammer in his hand. Mrs. Dutton called from the kitchen for an extra pot of water. Life went on because people chose to keep it going. That was the final truth Eleanor carried now. She had not crossed half the country to be rescued into stillness. She had come west and found a place where her choices mattered. Caleb came back inside, just as the first evening chill touched the windows. Eleanor was waiting at the table with the accounts aligned and the lamp lit. He stopped beside her, close enough to share the light, not close enough to crowd it. Outside, the ranch settled into the dark. Inside, the future had not become easy, but it had become theirs. And somewhere beyond the county line, a new dispute waited in the paper trail, quiet as a match before flame.